In this video, I'm going to be discussing a piece called The Values Built into Technology by David Morrow. So let's begin with the central question. As with any piece that we're going to read, the first thing you need to do is look at what is the main issue, and then what is the author trying to argue. So the central question here, the central issue is whether or not technologies are value neutral or value laden. So let me just give a sort of a simple explanation, a cursory explanation of what that means. So a technology would be value neutral if the bad or good consequences of the technology are not on the technology, but rather on the users of the technology. So the technology is not responsible for the bad or good consequences resulting from the technology, but rather the users. So the technology itself is neutral, value neutral. On the other hand, if technology is value laden, then the good or bad consequences of the technology are on the technology. It's sort of, the technology is sort of responsible for, in a sense, those consequences. So to just kind of make this more concrete, as an example, we can ask, okay, are the bad consequences of social media a result of the social media itself? And the social media, the technology itself is sort of responsible for it? Or is it solely the responsibility of the users? Is it solely because of the users that we have these bad consequences? So Morrow is going to argue that technology is not always value neutral, that technology is often value laden. So he's not saying that technology is necessarily value laden. He's just arguing that it can often be value laden. And what we're going to see here is he's going to give his argument in a step-by-step form, and then we're going to sort of work through that argument where he supports each of his premises. First, he needs to characterize what value neutrality means, what value ladenness means, and he's going to argue against what he calls the value neutrality thesis. And this is how he's going to characterize it. So I'm just going to quote him from the book. So he argues against this thesis, which states that all technologies are value neutral in the sense that any bad consequences using the technology happen because users have blameworthy preferences with respect to the technology use, or they use technology without knowing that it has bad consequences. And any good consequences result from users' praiseworthy preferences with respect to the technology's use, or users' ignorance that the technology has good consequences. So that's kind of a mouthful. Let's just kind of break that down and simplify it. The basic idea behind the value neutrality thesis is that the users are responsible for the good or bad consequences of technology, not the technology itself. So that's more or less basically what the value neutrality thesis is stating. And he's going to argue against that sometimes this is not the case, or often actually it's not the case. Morrow goes on to lay out his thesis that he's going to defend, which he calls the value laden thesis. So this is how he characterizes the thesis. He says a non-negligible number of technologies can have bad consequences, even if morally decent people use that technology with full knowledge of the bad consequences of doing so, while other technologies have good consequences, even if none of the users have particularly praiseworthy preferences with respect to them. So to kind of simplify that a little bit, there's something about technologies themselves that produce good or bad consequences independent of the user's intentions. So according to this value-laden thesis, often the good or bad consequences of technologies, it's sort of like on the technologies. The technology is in some sense responsible for those consequences. Now, strictly speaking, it is a bit weird to attribute responsibility to inanimate objects, like most technology or all technology. But I still think it kind of gets at what Morrow's thesis is saying here. Now let's take a look at Morrow's argument against the value neutrality thesis, or in favor of his value laden thesis. So we'll start with the premises, and this will lead us down to the conclusion. First premise is that people respond to incentives in the aggregate and in the long run. Here, aggregate just means the sum, taken together, everything taken together. All right, premise 2. Technologies change people's incentives by making it easier, possible or more appealing to do certain things. So it follows from that technologies change people's behavior on average and in the long run in particular ways. Fourth premise, the behavior changes that technologies induce or cause can have good or bad consequences. And then the changes that technologies cause in people's behavior can lead to bad consequences even without ignorance or blameworthy preferences, or the converse, or to good consequences even without ignorance or praiseworthy preferences. And then it follows from that the value neutrality thesis is false. And again, the value neutrality thesis is saying users are responsible for the good or bad consequences of technology, not the technology itself. So what we're going to do now is kind of go through each of these premises and support them and explain them. See how Morrow does that. I want to explain this argument in a more informal way, just so we can get at the basic idea behind it and what's really doing the work and supporting his conclusion. So I think what Morrow is saying is this. He's saying, look, technologies change people's behavior on a large scale in the long run, and that behavior can have bad consequences. Now, here's the important point and the more controversial point. That behavior can have bad consequences, even if the users of the technology are totally innocent. They have no bad intentions, they only have good intentions, but nevertheless, that behavior, which is influenced by the technology, may have bad consequences. And so what that suggests, according to Morrow, is that the bad consequences are on the technology, not on the users, not on the people. So there's something about the technology itself that is responsible in some sense for the bad consequences, even though the bad consequences directly result from the behavior of people. And that is the value-laden thesis. Again, he's arguing that technology is value-laden, often, not necessarily, which means that the bad consequences of people using technology is on the technology, not on the people. Let's now look at how he expands on and supports each of his premises in that argument. So the first premise is that people respond to incentives in the aggregate and in the long run. So in other words, people respond to incentives sort of in sum. So like the sum of people taken together will respond to an incentive, and then that has an effect. And in the long run. Okay, an example can help explain this. So think about extra credit incentivizing students to do something. So I'll give you extra credit if you study more or something like that. So imagine you have two classes, one class with the extra credit, the other class without the extra credit. It's probably going to be the case that the students with the extra credit to do X, more students will be doing X in that class. So this is just it's a pretty simple example of how groups of people respond to incentives. They can be incentivized to do certain things or not do certain things. The second premise states that technologies change people's incentives by making it easier, possible, or more appealing to do such things. So again, technologies, for example, can make certain things, certain actions less costly or less risky, and so it changes their incentives to make it more likely to do those things. A concrete example would be traveling to faraway places. 500 years ago, it was a big deal to travel to faraway places. It was very risky. You may have to get on a clipper ship and travel across the ocean. It was costly with time and money. And so much fewer people per capita would travel to faraway places. But today, technology with aircrafts makes it way easier to travel, way less costly, less risky. So you're going to have more people traveling to faraway places. So this is an example of how technologies can incentivize, in the sum, large groups of people to do something by making, say, something easier to do. So those first two premises support the third premise. In other words, this third premise follows from those first two premises, which say, this third premise says, technologies change people's behavior as a whole in particular ways. It's not saying it always does, but technologies can change people's behavior and have, on the whole, in certain ways. And I think a lot of this is pretty clear. These first three premises, this third premise seems to be pretty uncontroversial. Lots of examples about how technologies have changed people's behavior in the aggregate or on the whole. The example that Morrow uses is the famous book by Putnam called Bowling Alone. So this was even before the internet, where he found that fewer and fewer people are going out and socializing, say, bowling together. That used to be a big thing. Well, why is this happening? Well, because of TVs. TVs are invented. It offered a much easier way of entertaining oneself. You don't even have to leave the house. You just turn on the TV. Lots of people started doing this. And on the whole, you see this change of behavior. Less people were going out and socializing, bowling or whatever. More people were just staying home inside. So this is just one among lots of examples of how technology can change, on the aggregate, on the whole, change people's behavior. I invite you to think of some other examples of this phenomenon. The fourth premise is pretty straightforward. It's saying that the behavioral changes that technologies induce or cause can have good or bad consequences. Again, pretty obvious, and it's important to point out that this isn't saying that the bad consequences are necessarily attributed to the technologies. They could be attributed to the people. So we haven't gotten to the value-laden thesis yet. So that's what the fifth premise is going to show. Again, the fifth premise is going to try to show that these bad consequences are often attributed to the technology, not the users of the technology. But one example, this is a bit speculative, but probably true, of this premise here, how these behavioral changes that technologies cause can have good or bad consequences would be social media. A lot of us are saying, social media has been around for a while now. At this point, there are generations of people who are sort of born into it. And a lot of us seem to be noticing that our attention spans are decreasing. I've kind of noticed it myself, and maybe it has something to do with social media use or scrolling. Just scrolling in general seems to have this consequence of shortened attention spans, and that seems to be a bad thing. I would say that's a bad thing. So that's an example of a bad consequence of the behavioral changes caused by technology. We're more likely, instead of to pick up and read a long novel, we're more likely to get up and scroll through X or Google or something like that, which lowers our attention span. Bad consequence. But let's move into the fifth premise, which is, I would say, the most important and controversial premise, where he's going to argue that often these bad consequences should be attributed to the technology rather than the people, and that supports the value-laden thesis. Now here's the important premise, premise 5. So I'll read it and then try to explain it. So here's how it goes. The changes that technologies cause in people's behavior can lead to bad consequences, even without ignorance or blameworthy preferences. So here's what he means. I'm going to leave out the ignorance part. So what he's saying here is that you have these changes in behavior caused by technology, and that can have bad consequences. And it can have bad consequences even if the people using the technology are totally innocent. They have good intentions. They have good preferences. They want to do good. And everyone using the technology can have this, or most people. But nevertheless, it still has a bad consequence. So what he's suggesting is what that entails, that's going to be the conclusion, is those bad consequences, it's on the technology, it's attributed to the technology, not the people. And that suggests that technology can be value-laden. Not necessarily, but can be. So the way he describes this premise here is, sometimes morally decent people, or even morally good people, acting on morally acceptable preferences, good intentions, can bring about bad consequences through the use of technology. So, in the next section, we're going to he's going to support this, and so stay tuned. But for now, what he wants us to see is that if this is true, then technology itself can be responsible for the good or bad consequences of that technology being used by people. In other words, the good or bad consequences are attributed to the technology, not the users of the technology. But let's take a closer look at why he says this right here. So we'll try to support this premise even more. Now he goes on to support that fifth premise. So he's going to try to support how morally decent people or morally good people can bring about bad consequences. So you may be a good person or a morally decent person, good intentions, but everyone taken together doing something can have bad consequences. So one example of this are collective action problems. So these are problems that you often see in economics or rational choice theory that refer to when a group of people could achieve some good outcome, overall good outcome by cooperating, but each person has a self-interest incentive to be uncooperative. And so what he argues is that even so, each person's still morally decent, but them acting in this self-interested way altogether brings about this bad outcome, this bad consequences. And there's lots of examples of collective action problems. And one thing that he emphasizes here is that this happens through technology. Often it can happen through using certain technologies. So certain technologies can exacerbate these collective action problems. So here's a couple concrete examples of collective action problems. Cars, gas-powered engines. The use of cars and gas-powered engines can cause pollution, carbon emissions, and that can have overall bad consequences, as we're seeing with climate change. Now, each individual person using their car to, say, get to work, they're morally decent people, and it seems to be a bit much to expect them to, say, get rid of their car, because how else are they going to get to work? Maybe they could ride a bus if they want to spend 2 hours commuting, but it just seems to be the case that you can be morally decent and still have a car or a big truck or whatever. But all taken together, people doing that produces this this bad consequence. Another example would be modern fishing technology. Can take a lot of fish out of the water, out of the ocean. So each fishing boat with this technology, it's in their interest to take a lot of fish. And each person doing that is morally decent. And if they were to not do it, it wouldn't have really made an impact given the big picture. But all fisher people doing this, taking as much fish as they can out of the waters, out of the oceans, could quickly deplete the waters of fish, and then that would have a bad consequence. So the basic idea here is that with collective action problem is you can have a whole bunch of morally decent people just doing what's in their interest, driving a car, fishing the oceans, whatever it may be. But all of it taken together will actually could create a bad outcome. And so what this suggests is it doesn't seem to be that it's on each individual. It's almost on just the collective system itself. That we can attribute the bad consequence to. Another example of how morally decent or good people can bring about bad consequences is short-term thinking. So this is valuing the present and near future more than the distant future. And economists would call this discounting. And this can lead to bad consequences. And everybody does this to some degree. And technology can provide more means of, for example, instant gratification. So discounting can be exacerbated by technology. For example, through technology, we can develop things like high fructose corn syrup, lots of preservatives, greater ability to highly processed foods, and then that gets us the packaged junk foods, chips, Twinkies, all that good stuff that really satisfies you in the short term, but long term, as we all know, can have bad consequences for your health. So this is an example of how technology can actually lead to this change of behavior where one might eat more junk food, which in the short term might be good because you get quick pleasure, but in the long term is bad. Another example of how technology can provide a means to instant gratification would be scrolling. This is an example I used earlier. So scrolling is a relatively new thing. Back in the day, there was no such thing as scrolling, but now there is scrolling. And you get a lot of instant gratification doing that. It's like eating junk food, but it's like junk food for the brain. You get little dopamine hits, right off the bat. So that's short-term gratification, but it's not good for you long-term, as I think we all know. And the point here is that morally good people, morally decent people do this stuff. They make junk food, scroll, doesn't mean they're a bad person, but it still leads to a bad consequence. Another example of how morally decent people can bring about bad consequences are through accidents. And the important point here is that technology can make these accidents, these mistakes, worse, more frequent, and harder to reverse. So there's lots of examples of this. Take weapons, weapon technology. Take nuclear weapons. That's a pretty advanced piece of technology. But if there is an accident and a nuclear weapon is sort of mistakenly goes off through a miscommunication, those consequences are pretty hard to reverse. And there have been a handful of close calls in recent history, especially during the Cold War. Just look at the Bay of Pigs, and then there's other examples of some close calls when it comes to nuclear weapons. It's actually quite scary. Misinformation. So now with the internet, social media, information flows very fast, and it's easier to spread misinformation. I mean, you always had it, starting with the printing press, but now it's even magnified with the internet and social media. And so this is an example of how technology can make the spread of information more frequent, and then people may base certain decisions off of misinformation just by accident, and then that can have bad consequences. So the point here that we've been seeing is that he's trying to support that fifth premise, which is saying that these bad consequences of people's behavior, which is caused by technology, can happen even if the people have good intentions, are morally decent people. And then that suggests that the bad consequences in these kinds of cases are attributed to the technology rather than the people. And that's basically the value-laden thesis. So now he raises an objection. So someone might object to Morrow and say, look, Morrow, it's not the technology's fault. In all these cases, it's not the technology's fault. It's really the fault of the users of the technology, maybe due to weakness of will, being irrational, being ignorant, whatever. But it's still going to be the user's fault. With the car example, you don't have to drive a car. There's always another option. You could move closer to work. You could take the bus. It may be burdensome, but you can still do it, and you have that choice. So it's still your fault. You're still part of the problem if you drive a car or whatever it may be. You're eating that junk food. You're making that choice. It's still your fault. Those bad consequences to your health is still your fault. And on the whole, it's still society's fault, you might say, on the whole, for their health to go bad. So the objection is saying, all these examples you give, you can still see or you can still cast it in a way where it's the user's fault, it's the person's fault, not the technology. So here's his response. I'm actually going to read his response to the objection. So this is what he says. He says, okay, it's true for many of these cases, like the collective action case, etc. Maybe not the accidents, but leave that aside. It's true for many of these cases that perfect people could avoid them. This is irrelevant. Humans make technology for other humans, not for saints or supercomputers. No one would deny that cigarettes are bad for you just because they pose no threat to beings that are radically unlike humans, like perfect beings. We would not say the problem is not in the cigarette, it's in the weakness of the human body that is to blame. Like, nobody would say that. So why should we say something similar about technologies that have bad consequences because of the way they interact with normal human psychology? Morally decent people fall victim to collective action problems. They discount the future and they make mistakes. When technologies make those things more likely or more harmful, they can make morally decent people do bad things. So I think what he's saying here is this objection is inconsistent with human psychology. If humans were perfect, this objection would work. But it's expecting too much out of humans. We are fallible, we're not perfect, and so this objection seems to be irrelevant, according to Morrow. Now Morrow offers a more in-depth case study or example of how technologies can lead to bad consequences through the users using it, even though no one involved has any bad intentions. The users don't have any bad intentions. So the example that he uses is social media. It's something we all are familiar with. And we can use like YouTube, for example, as a more concrete example. So the goal of social media platforms is to maximize user engagement. So with YouTube, what is shown to you is determined by some algorithm, and the goal of that algorithm is to keep you on YouTube. And so it does, however way it does that, it does it. So, but this is accomplished by, and you might say, manipulating us a little bit, or appealing to or hijacking certain biases that we have. So one bias that we have is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the human tendency to seek out information that confirms what we already believe and ignore information that goes against what we believe. And we do this because we get a little boost when we see information that confirms what we already believe, and it feels icky. We feel cognitive dissonance when we are exposed to information that goes against our beliefs. And so if the algorithm is showing stuff that goes against our beliefs, yeah, we're going away. We're not staying on the platform. So the platform is engaging our confirmation bias, showing stuff that we already believe. And also maybe some other things, like maybe more extreme stuff, because it elicits some dopamine or whatever. And then we can see how this can result in bad consequences. It can lead to the spread of misinformation. It can lead to people just being sucked into echo chambers where nothing they believe is ever challenged. That undermines critical thinking and getting at the truth. And it can also lead to polarization. So just a quick example of this was Pizzagate. So this way that social media works can spread conspiracy theories, the Pizzagate conspiracy theory, which can lead to people doing things that are pretty bad. These are bad consequences. So the Pizzagate conspiracy theory led to a guy going into this pizza place and firing off some shots. It's a bad consequence. So this would be an example of how people who could be good people, good intentions, are engaging with social media, and then it changing things and leading to these bad consequences that really seem to be attributed to the social media itself, the technology itself, rather than the people using it. Morrow ends with, I think, a very important point or question, which is, if the value neutrality thesis is false, if it's true, in other words, that the bad consequences of using technology are attributed to the technology itself, like the way it's designed, what does that imply about the responsibility of engineers or people who design this technology? So I'm just going to quote him here. To quote Morrow, creators have a responsibility to think about how their technologies will change people's behavior and whether those changes will be for the better or the worse, as well as a responsibility to design technologies in ways that minimize bad consequences from those changes in behavior insofar as one can predict. So the implication seems to be here that if much of the bad consequences are attributed to the technology itself, the design of the technology, then the designers have a responsibility to design the technology well in a way that will prevent these bad consequences. And this can be um, challenging because often what we see is that if you have a profit motive to say keep people on the platform, that can be in tension with maintaining good overall consequences. Um, and so, one thing to think about at the end of this lecture is think of some technologies that may produce certain bad consequences, like social media, Facebook, X, etc. And think about ways that you could redesign those in order to prevent these bad consequences.